very much, Meta. So it's a pleasure to come and talk to you today. So it's a little bit different talk than I usually give. Usually I'm giving talks to engineering students, so we tend to get technical. You're an engineering student?
Not student. I'm engineering background.
Great, great. So there's an engineering flavor here, but I'm going to talk about things from a little bit of a higher level. I'll zoom in a little bit, talking about some of the things that we've done that relate to water scarcity, and just talk a little bit about how technology can play a role in trying to help alleviate water scarcity, and how it fits in with other things that need to be done. So, just to give you a bit of a flavor, so Meta talked a little bit about some of the work that I've done looking at solar desalination, but in my research group in general, we work on a broad range of different things, but usually we're looking at technologies, and a lot of times we're looking at new technologies, engineering new technologies. Because I wanted to give a big picture of water scarcity, I'm not going to really talk about any of these projects in detail, but if you want to chat with me about some projects, we do work looking at anything from solar desalination. We look at developing new treatment mechanisms in terms of foams, extracting energy from water streams using small hydro turbines. Some of the bigger projects we have are looking at actually improving water quality for fish ponds in the developing world, and also looking at how we can make agriculture more sustainable in general. So I'm not going to talk in detail about any of these projects. I'll sprinkle a little bit in from time to time as I go through the talk. But I'm going to talk about water scarcity from a really high-level perspective before zooming in and talking a little bit about what we can do. So when we're thinking about water in general, you can think about where we are, right? And why is there an issue with water in general? You know, here on the planet Earth, there's lots of water available, right? You take a look at us, take a look at the planet. It's mostly blue, right? There's lots of water, but the challenge is what we use and what part of that water that we use, most of it is actually not accessible if you take a look at the water you see here. All the water on Earth, about 97% of that is actually in the oceans, which means it has salt in it, which means we can't drink it, means we can't use it for other things like agriculture as well. So really that 97% is not accessible to us in terms of what we need it for, what we need to use water for. What we can use and what we can access is fresh water, which is mostly in ice caps and glaciers, and less than 1% of the water which is available on Earth is actually water which we can use, right? So of all the water that's there, there's 1% which is actually usable, as it is right now. So this is really the root of the problem. There's water there, lots of water, but not a whole lot that we can actually use. And as a result, there's lots of places on Earth which are called water stress. So this is actually a plot that I made using an online tool just yesterday of the current state of water stress in the world. So this shows different areas, and what it shows is it shows, based on color, how much water that area is using as a percentage of what is renewable in that area. So these areas that are in the yellows have lots of water available, but these areas that are in the reds are withdrawing water really at an unsustainable rate, because you can't be able to withdraw even all the water that's available, right? So there's lots of regions here which are under water stress. Lots of regions in the Middle East, North Africa, Southern Africa, and there's other regions as well, even though they're not withdrawing a huge percent of their water resources, which are considered under water stress as well. So this is showing physical water stress, but there's lots of regions as well that aren't able to access their water resources because of financial limitations, economic water stress. And that exhibits most of Africa and many regions of Central South America as well. So this water scarcity or water stress is a huge issue for a large portion of the globe. So what are we using this water for? We can look and see what we're using it for. And actually, most of the water is being used, not super surprisingly, and agriculture. So a lot of this water is being used in terms of being able to irrigate, provide, and grow food, whereas less is being used for different industrial uses, municipal uses. And this red bar here, while somewhat small, is different losses that we have in the system as we have our waters being transmitted. So this kind of gives us and sheds some light as well in terms of what's really important to be able to see, can we do things to help reduce our water usage? Agriculture is our big driver that's basically causing this water stress. And what makes it even worse when we're looking at water stress is the fact that it's actually projected to get worse. So this is actually showing areas where this water stress is going to increase in the next 23 years. They're shown in red, and areas where it's going to decrease are shown in these blue colors. What you'll notice is that most of the areas that are actually showing up on here, especially in the areas that are already water stressed, are only going to get worse in the next 20 plus years. Any guesses as to why that might be? What's going to be the big influences in terms of why water is becoming more and more of an issue?
Population is one.
Yeah, so population is one. I think you hit most of the big ones, right? One other thing I wanted to quickly, so this water stress and the amount of water availability is just going to keep decreasing. And part of the reason for that is the fact that, yes, the population is going up. And what it makes this even worse from a water sustainability point of view is the population is growing. And what you'll notice here as well, where the big chunk of this population is actually growing is in these less developed regions. In these less developed regions, they have less resources available to try to extract that water. It makes it harder for them to be able to do many different things. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the rest of the lecture today. So population is one reason that it's going to get worse. The other reason is, yes, for some of these regions, is the effect of climate change and effects of climate change. So I'm going to show you a couple different pictures here. Here's one picture. This is a picture from 2011. And this is a picture of the same area in 2014. Any guesses as to where this is?
Because of them.
So this is a water reservoir,
California.
but it's California. Yeah, it's California. California has been in a severe drought for the past 6 years, and as a result, yeah, this is their water reservoirs. This is one of their water reservoirs. I'm going to talk a little bit more about California because California is a bit of a special case looking at water. And we'll talk a little bit more about California also in a little bit in the lecture. Okay, so water is a big problem. There's lots of places where water is not being used at a sustainable rate, and it's projected that it's going to get worse. So, but where is this really a really big problem? And access to water, if you take a look at the countries that are listed on the bottom of this plot here, this shows the average daily water usage per person for different countries. Canada would be someplace around here as well, but it's not on this particular plot that I was able to pull out.
It has got to be before United States.
It is actually. It is because of the a lot of the industrial
How
uses.
could you waste the #1 waster water?
Yeah. So this is showing water usage for these different countries. What you'll notice is all the countries which are over here on the plot are all low-income countries. So there's a strong link between the fact that access to water, being able and actually use of water, and poverty, right? And this has a big impact on aspects looking at global development. So if we look at here, this plot on the right here, and it's not showing up super well. This is showing two different plots. This one is actually showing water and the number of people who don't have access to an improved water supply. And this plot here, this plot bar here is showing sanitation and the people that don't have access to adequate sanitation.
So high is bad.
High is bad. High is bad. Both of them are bad. So if you look here, there's about this is from a few years ago, but it's very similar. About 1 billion people that don't have access to an improved drinking water supply. And of those people that don't have access to clean drinking water, most of them are very poor. More than 2/3 have less than $2 a day in terms of income. And 1/3 is less than $1 a day. People without sanitation, this is 2.6 billion people, about half of them are living on less than $2 a day. So to be able to look at this, there's a really strong link between water scarcity, this is the case, it's economic water scarcity, and poverty. And I'll touch on a couple different places that I personally have examples and different things that people can do to help eliminate water scarcity in these areas. One of the places where I've been doing some work is in Nicaragua, here in Central America. It's actually the second poorest country in terms of GDP per capita in the Western Hemisphere, after Haiti. And in Nicaragua, about 30% of that population lives on less than $2 a day. So in the context of some of the work that I've been doing, I've been working here at the university with some students. These are actually undergraduate students on capstone projects looking at actually how we can, with a particular community and an NGO in Nicaragua, seeing at how we can help to alleviate some of these issues looking at water scarcity. And why it's a real big problem in Nicaragua, in particular, is that Nicaragua actually has a really long dry season, about half the year. It doesn't rain very much, maybe tiny bits, but not much. So they have huge dry season. And this is actually what the landscape will look like in Nicaragua during that dry season. It's really, you can see all the brown grass. So, and part of the challenge is here, because of the fact that 30% of the population lives on less than $2 a day, and the government doesn't have a huge amount of funds, there's limited resources there to actually improve the infrastructure of the water systems. Okay, so this is a challenge. And the fact that there's this link between limited access to water and in these regions also links up with issues with health, and health particularly in some of these resource-constrained settings. So this is a plot here that shows, actually plots deaths which occur in countries as a result of unsafe water, sanitation, and hygiene. And what you'll notice is a lot of these areas, they are water stressed. A lot of Africa is water stressed in terms of economic water scarcity. And for these areas, about 80% of the sicknesses which occur are due to unsafe water and sanitation. And water and sanitation is actually, unsafe water and sanitation is actually the leading cause of death for children under 5 years old. So having access to reliable water for these areas is a critical thing. And it's actually something that really, this is one of the things, it's almost a cyclical problem, right? We're talking about not having access to water, and part of the reason that they don't have access to water is because they don't have money. But then they can't necessarily also make money because they lack access to water, right? So this is actually a very common sight you'll see in many of these areas. This is a woman walking to get water. If you have to spend many hours a day walking to get water, when do you have time to work to actually make money? And it propagates even through, through many ages. As the children themselves will also have to walk and get water because they don't have access to it, and then not being able to go to school and other aspects. So this is a really big challenge, and water scarcity has a huge impact on the economics of these countries.
And water is heavy. You're
It's
tired
heavy.
after.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, for sure, for sure, for sure. So I probably wouldn't have been strong enough as a kid to be able to do this, but
That's why you're a prof.
that's why I am a prof, I guess. I'm strong enough to stand on my feet for 3 hours and lecture, right? So that's why I'm a prof. So it has a huge impact. What else does this water scarcity? There's other things that we can look at this water scarcity and what issues it has. But one of the biggest issues, especially in the context of a group like this, which is called Science for Peace, is that it actually can cause conflicts as well. And there's been many people that have had quotes like this, including Kofi Annan and whatnot, but this was one from 1995, and the perspective of Ismail Serageldin, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, is that if there was a war this century, it's going to be over water. Previous wars were fought over energy, oil. This century, water is going to be one of those leading sources of conflict. And there's lots of regions where this kind of war over having access to these types of resources, or conflicts over access to this type of resources, exists. So, according to the UN, there's about 1,400 new dams or diversion projects currently underway on rivers which cross borders. And this is a big source of conflict. There's many places in Africa where there are these kind of conflicts kind of coming up against each other. Well, I'll talk a little bit more a bit later about the Nile River. Nile River's been a source of conflict for some time. But the fact that people basically are countries diverting water can be a big source of friction. And the problem with many of these different projects is that these projects were undertaken without consultation or any consultation going back and forth between the affected parties. So this water scarcity can have many impacts. Economic, peace and safety. So what can we do about it? What can we really do to be able to help alleviate some of these water scarcity issues? So there's different things that we can think about it. From an engineering standpoint, what I like to do when I'm thinking about a problem is you start by breaking it down fundamentally. Okay, so fundamentally, what can I do to get more water, right? So what can we do? You might be able to find new sources of water, maybe things that you didn't know that existed. But it could be challenging. Most of them are already discovered. The other way is that we could think about treating recently or currently unusable, things that would not be considered usable, sources of water. We can't readily use seawater to be able to drink or to irrigate land for agriculture. But if we take the salt out, we can, right? Or we can think about treating other types of water sources which are contaminated. Or we can think about, okay, so either we need to find more water, get water we couldn't use before, make it so we can use it. Or the other option is to think about, can we use the water that we are using more efficiently, right? So really, we can think about in many different ways, shapes, and forms, but here you can think about, I'm going to talk a little bit about producing food with less water required, because agriculture is that huge chunk of the pie. And we can think about other things that we could do as well to be able to help improve that water scarcity aspects. So really, for a lot of places, what this revolves around, being able to alleviate water scarcity, in the end, a lot of times boils down to actually developing large-scale infrastructure projects. I talked about California. We showed the picture of California. one from 2011 and one from a few years ago, and saw what the difference was. So California is a really great example of a region that had done things to be able to look at alleviating effects of water scarcity. So California, there's a huge population in California. Almost all of California is in a big drought right now, but this area down here is largely desert-like. San Diego, Los Angeles. So what California actually did was they had large-scale infrastructure projects to be able to alleviate the water stress, particularly in the Southern California area. And so what they actually did was they put in aqueducts from all these different regions to be able to channel water to where they needed it. Whether that was good or bad, as a result of actually putting in some of these aqueducts, Los Angeles really grew in size because they were able to have access to resources. But this is what they did, was they put in these aqueducts. And so,
either overland or underground?
A combination of both. Some of the bigger, most of them have some open channels. I'm going to talk a little bit about this Colorado River aqueduct in just a bit. What's really startling about this, and before I learned much about California and their water situation, I didn't realize that about 20% of the total energy use in California is actually devoted to pumping water around and treating water.
Wow.
It's absolutely crazy. And it makes sense when you think about it. So I'm going to talk about this aqueduct here, this Colorado River aqueduct. This aqueduct pumps water from what it sounds like, the Colorado River, and it pumps it up and over mountains, and then comes back down into this Southern California, and then it's piped into Los Angeles and San Diego. So this is actually, this Colorado River aqueduct was actually built during the Great Depression. It's actually considered an engineering, so they had one of the, maybe it was 1955, I think there was like a civil engineering competition saying the greatest feats of engineering, 7 wonders of engineering. This was one of them, the Colorado River aqueduct. So basically it siphons water off the Colorado River at the border with Arizona, and then pumps it up and over mountains and then down into Los Angeles, and then eventually also some goes down to San Diego.
How high does it pump?
How high does it pump? I'm not 100% sure. I'm not 100% sure of the exact height. I think this aqueduct alone is at least 1% of the water energy usage of the state, but I'm not sure exactly what the height is that it actually pumps the water up and over.
How much?
About 1% of the energy usage of the state. So it was built during the Great Depression, and also when it was being built. So you can look at the size of this. This is the entrance into this aqueduct. At the time it was built, it actually employed over 10,000 people. And over the course of the project, there was about 30,000 people that worked on actually building this aqueduct. So this was one approach to being able to alleviate that water scarcity. Obviously, it's something which is enormously expensive, and it continues to be expensive because even the infrastructure's there. They still need to put in the energy to move the water up and over the mountains and down into the city. But it alleviated this water scarcity in this area. Something else that they're doing in California is they're actually bringing desalination online. So California is along the ocean. So desalination, being able to take ocean water and then remove the salts from that water, is a potential source. So this is a map of California, and this actually shows locations where they currently have desalination plants in red. So there's only 3, but there's 15 others in process to be able to alleviate some of these issues in California. And the longer this drought goes, the more and more that are going to actually have to go online. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about desalination, just in a little detail in terms of what it actually does. And that's partially because some of my research is related to desalination. So there's 2 main ways. So basically what these plants are doing is they are taking water that has salt in it and they're getting, at the output, it's water that doesn't have salt. So there's two ways that they do it in general. Either it's a thermal process, so you can think about boiling water and then condensing it, and then you get fresh water. But that's really energy intensive, so it's not very common unless there's a source of heat, which is really cheap, like next to a power plant. Power plant pumps out heat. You can use it as like a secondary in these thermal desalination processes. So this is actually not the standard. It's not used very often. What is the leading technology when we're looking at desalination is called reverse osmosis, or a membrane-based kind of desalination approach. And if you have, some people may even have a reverse osmosis system in their kitchens, basically to purify water that comes into your house. We don't really need to do it here in Canada. Our water's tested pretty thoroughly, but people do have it. The people I knew that did have it actually who I knew from graduate school actually lived in Southern California, but that's beyond the point. So what this process actually does, this reverse osmosis process, is kind of what it sounds like. So what happens when you have osmosis? Basically, you would have fresh water and you'd have water with something else in it, some salt in it, on either side of a membrane. So what happens with osmosis is water would move across this membrane from the region where the water is in high concentration to where it's in lower concentration. And basically water would move in this way. What we do in reverse osmosis is basically we take this salt water and we reverse the process by applying a pressure which is high enough, so it's higher than the osmotic pressure, and then we can actually push the water back and we can actually get fresh water out. So what we end up with is clean water on one side of the membrane, and then water with extra salt in it on the other side. And in these big reverse osmosis systems, what we end up having is you have a pump. It pumps water into a series of these membranes. Part of it comes out as fresh water, and then part comes out as brine, so it's water with extra salts in it, basically. So this is what California, so they're bringing a whole bunch of these plants online to help alleviate some of this water scarcity. But these plants are really big. So this actually isn't California, because California, they're bringing their big plants online. This is actually a picture from Israel. And desalination is used extensively in Israel to be able to alleviate some of the issues it has with water scarcity, because it's in a water scarce region as well. So this is actually a footprint of what one of these desalination plants looks like in Israel. It's pretty big, and this is what it looks like on the inside. So each one of these circles here, this is a long pressure vessel, so it basically contains that membrane that I was talking about, and it's using that to be able to desalinate water. So look at how enormous this is. So this is something which can work in a developed world context where you have the capital behind to put into looking at developing these types of technologies. But it's not the type of thing which is really easily applicable to a lot of those places where water is really, really needed in these remote communities. So it is used extensively in Israel as a way to be able to get their fresh water. So these red stars here denote all the desalination plants in Israel. The world's largest desalination plant, actually the world's largest, the world's second largest, and the world's third largest are all in Israel. And it produces 60% of its actually freshwater needs from desalination. But this is something which is really tough to apply to the developing world. It's possible if you have the right infrastructure in place. And you make sure the systems are designed in an appropriate way. But the best plants that are the ones that are here in Israel, they use about somewhere between 2 and 4 kilowatt hours per meter cubed of water produced. So, and there's a certain limit in terms of how efficient these types of systems can get. So, but we're not there yet. Our plants are typically somewhere between 2 and 4, and our thermodynamic limit is about 7.7. So there's some room to go there, right? And you can think about how you might be able to engineer some of these systems to be accessible for these developing world applications as well. So in the context of some of my work, I've been working with an organization called PV Pure. This is actually an organization that was started after I left MIT. Some of my former lab mates started this organization, and they're working, they've got some operations in Mexico, people who are living and working in Mexico, and they're actually working to actually develop these types of small-scale reverse osmosis units. The large-scale plants, what's actually good about it is, for this reverse osmosis, is that the components are modular, so you can actually scale it down to something that's much smaller scale. And so they're working actually on two different fronts. So they actually sell units that look like this to small resorts and other places in Mexico, and then use some of the funds to be able to finance working with communities and then installation in communities of these types of systems. But even from a research perspective, there are lots of questions there in terms of what we can do, not only for these types of systems, but for desalination in general. Can we do things to make it so it's going to be more energy efficient? I was talking about how desalination right now takes somewhere between 2 and 4 kilowatt hours to produce 1 cubic meter. But based on thermodynamics, we can get it lower. We can get it up to around 0.7. So can we do things to make it so it's going to be more efficient? Can we do...
What's the thermodynamic limit, if I may ask?
Thermodynamic limits. So that has to do just with the... Yeah, so I'm trying to think what's the best way to kind of express it. So it's basically, it's a mixture. So you can think about, you mix salt and pepper together, right? And in order to get the salt and pepper separated, there's a certain amount of work you need to be able to do to be able to get the pepper out from the salt, right? So similarly for doing this, there's a measure called Gibbs free energy of the different water streams. And that's basically similar to the measure of like salt and pepper. So like that's basically saying this is the minimum amount of energy that we need to, based on how much that changes, the minimum amount of energy we need to put in to be able to make it so we get fresh water on one side and then water with extra salt in on the other side. So you think about it, salt and pepper shaked together, you need to put work in if you want to sort them out. This is similar, it's just like you can quantify it in terms of thermodynamics. So.
Well, I like to read a paper. That sounds interesting. Yeah,
okay. I can find you some afterwards. Nitish actually can maybe refer you to some papers. There are other things that we can do. Can we think we can make this more cost-effective in some way? And then there's other things that we can do to look at, particularly when you're installing it in these types of environments, there's lots of interesting things that will happen that you don't have in those big-scale plants. These small-scale plants tend to be operated intermittently, and there's kind of some challenges associated with that. So how can we engineer systems that are going to be more reliable for these types of applications? So there's lots of things that we can think about from a research perspective that we might be able to improve here. Okay, so we talked a little bit about California, and we talked a little bit about some of its water challenges. But let's take a look at some other things which are highly influential when you're looking at water scarcity. And agriculture is that big slice of the pie, right? It's that huge amount of water which is being used to be able to produce food. And so a lot of that water is being used because traditional agriculture, if it's using irrigation, is doing stuff that looks like this. It's basically sprinkling water over top of different fruits and vegetables. And then as a result, you have a huge amount of water which is actually not being used effectively because water evaporates off, and as a result, it's not going where you need it, which is basically to the roots of the plant and then up into what you want to have, which is the plant growing. So there's different people who are looking at, and there's different ways that we can improve that usage of water. One is actually using drip irrigation. And this is like an image of some drip irrigation here being installed. So this is actually a pipe which is running along the base of the plants. And there are small holes, basically little emitters at the base of each of these plants. And basically it drips small amounts of water right out by the root of the plant. So basically it can be used much more effectively. People are also looking at other types of technologies. I'm not going to talk about them today. Basically hydroponic technologies that can really kind of increase the efficiency of this water usage. But a lot of these require some infrastructure of some sort. And this lack of irrigation is one of the biggest limitations for farmers in the developing world. And it's actually been really well shown that this is from a study looking at income levels from farmers and the intensity of irrigation, so the percentage of their land which is actually irrigated. And there's a really strong correlation between farmers having good income and having irrigation, which makes sense, right? Because if you have irrigation, you're going to be able to grow more crops, you're going to get more better yields from your farm. So this is one of the things we've been looking at in the context of some work that I've been doing with some capstone projects actually, and in Nicaragua. So agriculture is a really big economic driver in Nicaragua. And as I mentioned before, there's two seasons in Nicaragua. One is the dry season, the other is a rainy season. Dry season looks like this. Grass is all brown. And then in this particular project, we're working with this small community of Pedro Arauz. And in Pedro Arauz, there were a few families who had implemented irrigation projects. And they were able to take land that looked like this and make it look like this. So it's not super bright here, but you can see there's actually bananas right here. So it can make a huge difference, especially in that dry season, right? So there is this group that we've been working with. It's called Winds of Change. And these farmers are actually quite smart and quite savvy about the fact that they realize that they want to use the water really, really efficiently. So this is actually a picture of Juan. This is one of the innovative farmers that we were working with in Pedro Arauz. And he had set up his own, water pumping system. He was using diesel fuel because he didn't have reliable electricity, but that's beside, like, it's not necessarily the cleanest fuel source. So he was able to pump water from the ground, and he was able to run it to different plants. And then he was also had fruit trees, and this is actually his simple drip irrigation system that he had set up was actually a soda bottle where he had punched a hole in the top and hung it by the plant to be able to, so it would drip water on the roots. So these farmers are really quite savvy. And so, but this is the common practice if they are doing irrigation in this area. If they're doing it in some sort, either they will be pouring the water on the plants. This isn't a picture from Nicaragua, but this is the main method, one of the main methods they'll be using. They actually will pump water into these trenches and flood different areas of the land. But this is not very water efficient. There's going to be a huge amount of water that's lost. So it's much better if we're able to do something like this. So we were thinking about this, and Winds of Change, they came to the university, thinking about, can we do something that we can work with these farmers to try to, and use some engineering knowledge to help them get to the point where they'll be able to have more sustainable farming practices and be able to improve their yields. So they came a couple years ago, and I've been supervising a couple of projects with Winds of Change and a local NGO in Nicaragua that works with these communities on a daily basis called Seeds of Learning, to look and see if we can help to improve some of their agriculture, at least look at working together with them to be able to improve some of their agricultural yields by looking at particularly water use. So we looked at a couple different projects. We've looked at helping and looking at, can we work with the NGO to develop some very basic sizing tools with which they can use to be able to engineer these types of drip irrigation systems for different types of applications which they might have. We've also worked on getting some sustainable pumping technologies. So this is actually a picture from one of the capstone teams I supervised a year and a half ago, which we actually worked with this community to locally build, all using the members of the community did the building, a windmill locally in this location that could then be used to be able to pump the water which was going to be used for this irrigation. So we've been working together with this NGO for a couple years. And we're continuing to work with them to look at how we can help improve some of these sustainable irrigation practices. In the end, to try to make this, make it more water efficient and more sustainable for these areas. But this is just a little piece of what we can do, because this is only on a really local level. Really, to make it so these communities can have more sustainable water and be able to alleviate some of this water scarcity, there needs to be some initiative which comes from the government, because they can only pump so much water on their own for irrigation. So really, there needs to also be some large-scale infrastructure which is going to go in if it's going to be able to alleviate some of these water scarcity issues. And in the end, that comes into different kinds of things. This is actually some plots. This is actually through the World Bank as well, looking at what, in terms of water usage from different countries, and how much water storage, so this would be reservoirs or other kind of infrastructure, is available. So you can see down here on the bottom left of this plot, this is Ethiopia. And South Africa is up here with much more water storage capacity, and as correspondingly they have more water which they can use for some of their work. So the question is, really, and the challenge is, how do we get, what can we do to help get countries which are in this kind of situation so they can have infrastructure to be able to have more accessibility to water and enable more activities and enable people to be able to conduct their daily life without worrying about where their water is going to come from. So this is a big challenge. If you do some very basic costing in terms of what it would take if you wanted to put water reservoirs that's going to move Ethiopia up to this area where South Africa is, it's about 5 times the GDP of Ethiopia, the annual GDP of Ethiopia. So how do we make this happen? There needs to be some investment to be able to really make this happen. And it's not that countries like this are not trying. They are, in some respects, trying to be able to get this type of water availability for some of their citizens. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one last aspect, and then I'll open the floor to more questions. And I touched on this before, whereas water and having conflicting, having shared water resources which can be exploited by particular countries can be something which can cause conflict. And this is a plot which was put together by USAID that shows 3 of these, or 4 of these conflict kind of areas. These are different river basins. And these are areas which are really where there is kind of some butting heads that's going on, like that, being able to manage and withdraw water from some of these sources. I'm going to look in particular at this Nile Basin. So this Nile Basin, it encompasses 10 countries total, and there has been head bunting over the years. There are different dams and different reservoirs that people have built off the side of the Nile, but there has been a formation, and there is a formation of an initiative to be able to have cooperation amongst these 10 countries. And it's one of those things that has been going on for about the past 15 years. And it helps to alleviate some of these sources of conflict, but these conflicts still exist. So there needs to be more mechanisms to be able to look at this type of cooperation. It's not something that's my specialty, but it's one of the things that needs to happen to be able to make sure that we are able to alleviate some of these water scarcity issues, and that we don't have major issues in terms of conflicts going forward. Okay, so I'll just quickly wrap up what I was talking about, I talked a lot about water scarcity, and it's something that's a big challenge in the context of global development and a potential source of conflict. I talked about how things can be done to help alleviate some of these water issues. There's some technical approaches which are being developed, looking at desalination, looking at ways that you can use the agricultural water more efficiently, because that's really the big driver behind a lot of the water usage. But unfortunately, a lot of those types of approaches are not really able to reach the really low income bracket, which is actually where a lot of that water is really needed to be able to aid in economic development and to raise people out of poverty. If we're going to do that, and no matter what, if we're going to be able to do those things, there's going to be lots of cooperation that's needed. We're going to need, and for a lot of those really low income countries, there needs to be some mechanism to be able to make some of those larger scale infrastructure projects happen to be able to really lift them out of water scarcity. And that's all I have for right now, but I'm open to any questions you might have.